You may have already seen my previous 2 videos about takubas, and if you haven't, this may be a good chance to go check them out and perhaps subscribe to the channel as well. In any case, I thought it would be interesting to do a comparison video of the two. So you see them here. A little bit like we did with the Albertina swords, and perhaps a little bit like we did in a previous video comparing different walloon-hilted swords. And that is because while they are a similar style of sword, they are actually quite different in terms of a bunch of different metrics, and also in terms of a bunch of different details. So you can already see, obviously, the scabbard type and amount of decoration is quite different between the two. The hilt is very different, so the crossguard is different. This one is way thinner. You can see differences in the pommel, and there are also differences in terms of the properties of the blades. So the weight, the thickness, and kind of the metrics aspects of the blades are also quite different, so we are going to be measuring them as well today. So I hope you enjoy comparison videos, because this is going to be one of them, and let's dive straight into the close-ups. Okay, same but different. Time to compare two takubas. This is the first one we saw on the channel a couple of months ago or a few months ago, and this is the most recent one I purchased. We're going to start with a quick look at the aesthetic differences and the style differences between both the scabbard, hilts, and the blades. And then we are going to dive more into a few measurements and trying to get an understanding of what makes these swords different and how different they may be. So first we can look at the similarities. We'll see they both have the typical crossguard shape, the cylindrical grip, both wrapped in leather. We see, though, already some difference in terms of the pommels. This one has kind of a almond-shaped pommel, which we already saw last time is hollow. This one instead has a disc pommel that kind of ends in a pyramid, and you can see the peen here. And it has also these two decorative balls. In terms of the scabbards, they both have a similar hanging system in that they have two leather loops each that are permanently fixed onto the scabbard, and in a very similar position. However, these are very different too. On the first takuba here, we have a very, very delicate and I would say actually quite flimsy leather. So I'll show you on this side because it's in better condition. But it's almost paper thin. It's very, very delicate. And it almost gives the feeling that you would pass something through here to hold the sword up, like a belt or a sash or some kind of, you would suspend it using these as loops. Whereas here we have a very different configuration. We have the two leather loops, which in this case are thicker, but also these aren't used in the sense that you don't pass anything through these loops. Two further loops are fixed onto these, and then we have two suspension rings. Now, these suspension rings are also connected by some fabric, but I doubt this was part of the original hanging layout of the sword, let's say. So similar, yes, but definitely two very different styles or ways of using the scabbard, let's say. In terms of the scabbard itself, they both have brass decoration towards the throat. However, this one you can see has a very big throat here, and the brass arrives up to the actual throat of the scabbard. It does have some open work and some geometric kind of abstract decoration here, some lines and shapes. And under here is basically leather, as far as I can tell. Or it may even be the wood of the scabbard, I'm not sure. On this one, we see a brass section of decoration too, but it's way thinner. It has open work as well. Under here is red fabric. And the section here of decoration doesn't run up to the actual throat of the scabbard itself, but it's kind of a band that runs just about a finger's worth below the throat. What's interesting is they both have this kind of box design in the sense that they both have a midsection on the scabbard that is flanked or surrounded by a raised ridge on the sides. But on this one, it's really dramatic. So you'll see that the ridge here is a few millimeters thick, and as it runs down, it becomes even more dramatic here. It's quite a box shape, I would say, in a sense. What we see here is something that's a little more stylized. It's basically just a extra layer of leather that's flanking the center of the scabbard. So it's way more prominent than I would, if I didn't know that that one is kind of box-shaped, I wouldn't call this box-shaped either. It does get a little maybe more visible or prominent in some sections, but I think that's just because of the bending of the leather. However, a similar design again in terms of the middle section flanked by a raised section. When it comes to the shapes, we can see again some differences. First of all, this shape is way longer and also way more simple. This is basically just a brass sheet that's been folded to act as a shape here with no decoration or anything of the sort. Whereas here we see a rather elaborately decorated one. We see these little studs on this section here. We see the open work, which is decorated. And we have again the red fabric that recalls what we saw at the throat. Also, a difference that I'd like to show here is how the scabbard here kind of seems to end in the shape. It's not really a really organic transition into the shape, whereas here it feels like it follows one straight line down to the tip of the scabbard. Time to unsheathe the takubas, starting with this one, which I actually see will need a little bit of cleaning, or at least some oiling. I wouldn't want rust to start forming there. And then the most recent one, which was recently oiled, so it should be in good shape. Oh, and one difference I wanted to show you too was at the back of the scabbards. This one here is not stitched. You'll see the edge of the leather here is glued, whereas on this one we have stitch work and also decoration on the back of the scabbard. So I have to say it's hard for me to honestly say which one of the two is more elaborate, in the sense that the leather work on this one is definitely better and more fancy. But the kind of hanging section, like these loops, are way more elaborate here. This one has stitching, this one doesn't. And the brass work, I don't know. So it's hard for me to say if from the scabbards alone we can tell if one of the two is fancier than the other. Maybe if there's any takuba experts among you guys, feel free to let me know. If we look at the blades now, I'll place them this way again, we can start seeing some similarities and some differences. Well, let's put them like this again. So we have the old takuba and the new one. So we'll align the end of the hilt here and the start of the blade. So that's our kind of reference point for both of them. And I think the first thing we can notice here is that the grip on this one is considerably not just thinner, but it's overall scaled down compared to this one. All the elements, the grip, the crossguard here is smaller, the grip is thinner, but also it's shorter. So if we take some measurements here, we can see that the grip size on this one on the right is 9 centimeters, whereas on this smaller one, it's more like 8.1. Sure, there are some differences in the sense that your hand can kind of take over a little bit of space on the pommel on this one, whereas on this one you're kind of blocked by the disc shape. So you have a bit more adaptability on this one, but it's still visibly shorter. In terms of the size of the crossguard here, we have 3.5 centimeters on this one and 2 on this one, so considerable difference in terms of size. And of course, this probably translates into a difference in weight as well. The pommels, as I mentioned, it's hard to say because you may think that this one is lighter. However, this one is hollow. So actually, this one may have more metal to it than this one. In any case, the blades are both quite similar, at least at a superficial view. So I definitely need to clean this one. You can see some rust is forming. But we can see here they both have 3 fullers. These are a little more tidy and a little thicker, whereas these are really thin, and actually you can see they're a little bit messy, to be honest. However, these are simple fullers. This one has this central fuller, which has like this dotted decoration to it. But overall, a very similar kind of fuller configuration. We can move in now to looking at the half moon decor on these two blades. This, as I mentioned, is very typical on takubas, and you also see it on cascadas, of course. It's also very typical on European, but these are not European versions of that decoration. So you'll see on the old takuba, you have the moon with a stylized face on it. You can see the little eye there. This is, I would say, more similar to what you would find on European blades. So this is more close to the original European mark, but it is definitely not it. It's way more rounded and overall more stylized. What you see on the new takuba instead is a more abstract symbol. So the face is completely gone now, and you have a half moon with a line through it where you would have the features of the face instead. One other difference is also that the fullers on the old takuba actually are considerably longer, at least the central one. The central one goes on to about halfway up the blade, whereas on this one it goes about to the first third, I would say. The blades are typical takuba blades in that they symmetrically kind of taper down, but you'll see there's a difference here as well. This one, which is the old takuba, has a way more delicate taper, and it tapers down to a thicker rounded point. So overall, the blade kind of is less pointy, you could say, although none of the two are really pointy. The new takuba instead has a more dramatic taper, and yeah, you can see the difference. Maybe we can measure, but let's say at or around the tip we have, let's say we have about 2.2 centimeters here for the old takuba, and about 1.5, 1.6 perhaps on the newer one. So a considerable difference, I would say, in terms of how it ends. I don't know what the consequences are on these in terms of their cutting ability or their, like, obviously this is not a thrusting sword, this is a cutting sword. So I actually wonder which of the two is designed to be a better cutter, if any. It could even simply be that they're just two different smiths that forged two different blades, and that's just the way it is. If we look at sharpening lines, what's interesting here is you'll see the older takuba here has a few vertical file marks on the cutting edge here. They run kind of down up to 40% of the blade, halfway down the blade, I would say. So you see these small vertical marks, and then you see these deep gouges on the sides, and they're even more visible here towards the tip, and you see them on both sides. So the sharpening here seems to have been done first by really like roughly gouging the blade lengthwise, and then doing some fine filing vertically, so perpendicular to the blade. Things are considerably different on this blade instead. We do not see those parallel gouge marks. We kind of do see file marks, but they're not as visible, and they're not kind of along the blade, the cutting edge. They are all through the surface, all across the surface of the blade. And then we see instead diagonal file marks that I mentioned in the previous video about this sword, kind of are consistent on both sides. So this is the direction of the file marks. On this end, on this edge of the sword, they go towards the tip, and on this edge, they go away from the tip. And we see a similar thing here. So again, kind of diagonal marks that are asymmetrical between the two edges. I don't know what that means. This may be a difference in style, in regional style of sharpening and regional style of treating the blade, or it could simply be just two different people with two different habits, or it could even be that one guy was not very careful with treating his blade and one guy was. I don't know. However, again, if you do know, I would be very happy to hear the answer. Another difference you can see here is also the intensity of the sharpening. You'll see a sharpening line on the new takuba here, on both sides. I don't want to be blasphemous here, but it's almost reminiscent of a hamon in a sense. It's obviously not the same thing because it's not due to tempering or heat treating the blade. It's due to filing. But you do see this kind of line running all across the cutting edge. Whereas on this one, we do not see anything of the sort. The fine sharpening is really, really fine here. These file marks, these perpendicular file marks are not even, they're maybe a millimeter wide. So very different ways of treating the two blades. One last difference I want to show you here is that the pairing edge, so the forte of the older takuba, has this lip forming, let's say. It's almost as if it was hit multiple times, but that isn't really the case because it's actually quite, you don't see any signs of impact on the edge. So this, I think, is a consequence of the manufacturing process. You just kind of have this lip that wasn't then, or burr, that wasn't filed off or cleaned away. And again, here we have a considerable difference with this one, which instead is perfectly flush. Let's say it's smooth. So you don't feel any burr and you don't see any either. And that is it for the visual differences. We'll now start taking a few measurements so we have a more clear idea of these two swords overall. I have to say they both are quite tip heavy, and I have to say I struggle to feel a huge difference between the two, in the sense that they both feel very similar in terms of handling. So we'll see how that correlates to the actual measurements themselves. So I'll first align these blades at the end of the table so I have an easy way to measure their length. I am working, I promise, on a setup that will make things a little more pleasant to follow for you guys, but you have to just bear with me for a few more videos until I move to the new place. I'm measuring the length now, total length, so from the base of the pommel, let's say, to the tip. On this one, which is the new takuba, we have a length of 92.4, I would say. So not, well, quite a bit shy of a meter. The old takuba, which is this one instead, we have a length of 96. So a few centimeters difference, which on this amount of length, I think makes a difference. We will now weigh them, but none of them reaches the meter. So while they are actually imposing swords when you hold them, I have the feeling that they feel bigger than they actually are. I have some small swords that exceed a meter length, and they don't feel as hardcore, you could say, as these two. So we have our weighing scale zeroed there, and now we'll weigh first the old takuba. And we have 733 grams, which is not light. So the feeling of weight is warranted, definitely. It's not the heaviest sword, but it's definitely not a light one. And this one is the longer one of the two swords, by the way. Now we'll measure the new takuba. And let's see if we can get it. So this is 700. So, I mean, as expected, it is lighter, but it's also a, what is it, like 3.5 centimeters shorter. So while you would expect it to be lighter, it almost feels like it's heavier per centimeter of weight, so to speak. So it doesn't scale down in weight in the same way as it scales down in terms of size. We'll now take a couple of further measurements, just so, since we're at it today, we'll just measure as much as we can. So at the base of the blade here, the old takuba is 4.5 centimeters, whereas the new takuba is 4.5 centimeters. So at the base, they're exactly the same width, which is interesting because this one, as I mentioned, tapers down more acutely, you could say, than this one. And you can actually see it. This one almost feels more like a slab of metal in a sense. You can really see how the angle is not very steep. Whereas if we look at this one, you can actually see the tapering is visible and considerable as well. And last but not least, we'll check the point of balance. So on this new one, we had already seen in the previous video about it, that point of balance kind of fits more or less, is just above the half moon symbols, so kind of up here. And if we look at the old takuba, we will quickly see how this difference in taper and everything affects the sword. And the point of balance is actually a little under the moon symbols. Not that that means anything apart from being a quick reference point for us, but we will now measure how far from the hilt the point of balance is, really just empirically and not perhaps not super precisely. But if we start here at the end of the pommel and come to about here, we have, I would say, around 35 centimeters for the old takuba as point of balance. And if we take a look at the new takuba instead, we should see that from end of the pommel to, we're at about 35. So the point of balance is at the same length, more or less, for each of the two swords. However, this one is longer and heavier. So obviously, it means that on this sword, comparatively, it's way further ahead. What that means, we can discuss in the comments, but these are the basic measurements and the comparison of these two beautiful takubas. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another sword video. Bye.